Long before the neon glow of vape shops, before the glossy packaging of filtered cigarettes, before tobacco corporations hired chemists to engineer addiction, there was a fire. Not the controlled, domesticated fire of a modern hearth, but a wild, snapping, unpredictable thing built from dry leaves and desperation in some forgotten valley or windswept plain. An ancient human, perhaps a hunter who had not eaten in 3 days, perhaps a mother trying to soothe a feverish child, perhaps a shaman who had already spent too many nights listening to the wind and interpreting its howling as language, knelt over that fire and did something that defied every survival instinct encoded into their nervous system. They leaned in. They opened their lungs. They breathed in the smoke on purpose. And something happened. The world tilted. Pain dulled. Hunger vanished. Colors sharpened or blurred. The boundaries between self and surroundings dissolved like sugar in rainwater. That single inhalation was not just a moment of intoxication. It was the beginning of one of humanity's longest and most paradoxical relationships with the plant kingdom, a relationship that would evolve from sacred ritual to industrialized death sentence, from spiritual technology to global public health catastrophe. The question that should haunt anyone who has ever lit a cigarette, packed a pipe, or even walked through a cloud of secondhand smoke is brutally simple. Why did our ancestors, who fought so hard to survive against predators, famine, and disease, voluntarily choose to inhale toxic burning material into the one organ they absolutely needed to keep breathing? To understand the gravity of that choice, we have to imagine the world as it existed tens of thousands of years ago, when fire was still a relatively new companion in the human toolkit. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo erectus began using fire in some capacity around 1 million years ago, but controlled, habitual firemaking probably did not become widespread until roughly 400,000 years ago, and it was not until the Upper Paleolithic period, around 50,000 years ago, that fire became the central hub of human social life. Fire meant warmth in glacial winters. Fire meant protection against cave bears and saber-toothed cats that still prowled the darkness. Fire meant cooked meat, which delivered more calories and required less chewing, which in turn allowed our brains to grow larger and our jaws to shrink. But fire also meant smoke. Constant, unavoidable, lung-filling smoke. Early humans lived in small, poorly ventilated shelters, huddled around flames that burned whatever combustible material was available. Dry grasses, animal dung, resinous pine needles, hardwoods, and eventually, as they learned to identify plants with precision, specific leaves and flowers that produced unusual effects when thrown onto the coals. Imagine the scene with the clarity of a documentary camera that does not exist. A family group in a rock shelter somewhere in Eurasia, the fire sputtering low, someone tossing a bundle of dried leaves onto the embers to keep the light alive, and within minutes, the entire shelter filling with a thick, sweet, cloying smoke that makes the eyes water and the head swim. The first few times this happened, it was probably terrifying. Dizziness, nausea, a sense of floating or falling. But then, perhaps on the 100th or 1,000th accidental exposure, someone noticed that the headache they had carried for 3 days was gone. Someone else realized they were not hungry anymore, despite having eaten nothing since the morning before. A third person, the one who always spoke to the spirits, began to see patterns in the firelight that others could not perceive, began to hear voices in the crackling of the flames, and when they emerged from that smoke-filled shelter at dawn, they claimed to have traveled to another world and returned with messages from the dead. These were not random hallucinations to be dismissed. They were data points. They were the first entries in humanity's longest-running experimental journal, a journal written in ash and lung tissue, in altered neurochemistry and shared cultural memory. The transition from accidental inhalation to intentional smoking was not a single eureka moment, but a slow, grinding process of trial and error that probably took thousands of years and cost uncountable lives. Early humans were essentially running an open-air toxicology lab, with no safety protocols, no control groups, and no way to document their findings except through oral tradition, and the occasional burial of a pipe alongside a corpse. They learned, through bitter experience, that some plants killed you quickly, some killed you slowly, some made you see things that were not there, some made you feel things that were not real, and a precious few seemed to do something genuinely useful. They discovered that certain resinous woods, when burned, repelled mosquitoes and biting flies with an efficacy that must have seemed almost magical in malarial wetlands. They found that chewing the leaves of one plant dulled the pain of a broken bone, while inhaling the smoke of another plant sharpened the senses before a hunt. They realized that a particular fungus, when dried and burned, could induce visions so vivid and emotionally overwhelming that the experience could reshape a person's entire worldview. And somewhere in this chaotic, dangerous process of botanical experimentation, the deliberate act of smoking was born. It was not recreation in any modern sense. It was medicine, insecticide, spiritual technology, and social glue all rolled into one practice that required nothing more than fire, plant material, and the willingness to damage your own lungs in exchange for temporary relief from the crushing weight of existence. The archaeological record, when examined with modern scientific tools, tells a story that is far more complex and geographically widespread than most people assume. For decades, the dominant narrative held that smoking was an invention of the Americas, specifically tied to the domestication of tobacco by indigenous peoples in the Andes and Amazon regions around 8,000 years ago, with the practice spreading northward and eventually becoming global after European contact in the 15th century. This narrative is not wrong, but it is woefully incomplete, like describing the internet as a series of tubes invented in the 1990s, while ignoring the telegraph, the telephone, and the mainframe computer that made it possible. Recent advances in residue analysis, the chemical archaeology of ancient pipes and containers, have revealed that humans were inhaling psychoactive and medicinal smoke on multiple continents long before the first tobacco seed was ever planted. In the Americas, the evidence is staggering. Nicotiana rustica, a potent wild tobacco species, was being smoked or used as a snuff in the Andes as early as 12,000 years ago, based on microscopic residue found in pipes and mortars at sites in Peru and northern Chile. By the time European explorers arrived, smoking was not merely common, it was deeply embedded in the religious, political, and medical systems of virtually every indigenous culture, from the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego. The Maya had a tobacco god. The Aztecs used tobacco smoke to fumigate sick rooms and to anoint warriors before battle. The Huron and Iroquois nations used pipes in diplomatic ceremonies so sacred that breaking a pipe treaty was considered an offense against the cosmic order itself. But the Americas were not the only stage for this drama. In Eurasia, the story is equally strange and compelling. Cannabis, a plant native to Central Asia, was being cultivated for fiber and seed by at least 8,000 years ago, and there is strong evidence from burial sites in the Pamir Mountains of western China that it was being burned and inhaled in ritual contexts around 2,500 years ago. The Tarim Basin mummies, preserved in the arid climate of the Taklamakan Desert, have been found with cannabis fragments and what appear to be primitive smoking apparatuses, suggesting that the practice of inhaling cannabis smoke was known to Bronze Age peoples of the region. Even more intriguing is the evidence for the ritual use of other psychoactive plants in ancient Eurasia. The Scythians, a nomadic people who dominated the Pontic-Caspian steppe from the 9th century BCE to the 4th century CE, were described by the Greek historian Herodotus as throwing hemp seeds onto heated stones in small tents and inhaling the vapor, a practice that produced a state of ecstatic shouting that the Scythians themselves found hilarious. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, was often dismissed as a fabulist by later scholars, but archaeological discoveries of Scythian burial mounds have confirmed the presence of cannabis and primitive braziers that match his description almost exactly. The Scythians were not isolated primitives. They were a sophisticated, mobile culture that traded with the Greeks, the Persians, and the Chinese, and their smoking practices almost certainly influenced or were influenced by neighboring peoples. In Siberia and Mongolia, shamans of various traditions have used the smoke of Artemisia species, juniper, and birch bark for millennia to induce trance states, cleanse ritual spaces, and communicate with spirits. The use of smoke as a spiritual technology is so ancient and so widespread that it begins to look less like a series of independent inventions and more like a fundamental feature of the human cognitive toolkit, as basic and as universal as the use of stone tools or the creation of burial rituals. To truly grasp why ancient humans kept coming back to the fire, inhaling substances they knew were harmful, we have to abandon our modern categories of recreation, addiction, and vice, and instead enter the psychological and social world of prehistory, where survival was not a given and the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were not clearly drawn. For a hunter-gatherer living 20,000 years ago, the experience of smoking was not a casual break from work, a moment of relaxation stolen from a busy schedule. It was a high-stakes gamble with potentially cosmic consequences. Imagine a shaman in a frigid cave somewhere in what is now France, preparing for a ritual that the entire band's survival depends upon. The reindeer have not appeared in their usual migration pattern. The berries are failing. A child has died of fever, and the group needs answers, needs reassurance that the world is still ordered, that the spirits have not abandoned them. The shaman has fasted for days, has danced until exhaustion, has listened to the wind and heard nothing but random noise. Now they take a bundle of dried leaves, perhaps wild tobacco mixed with other local plants whose names we will never know, and they place it on the fire. The smoke rises, thick and acrid, and the shaman inhales deliberately again and again, pushing past the coughing, past the burning in the throat until the neurochemistry of their brain begins to shift. Dopamine floods the reward pathways. The visual cortex begins to generate geometric patterns, the so-called form constants that are hardwired into human perception. The sense of self dissolves, and the shaman experiences what modern neuroscience would call a dissociative state, a temporary collapse of the ego boundary that allows the brain to make novel connections, to perceive patterns in noise, to generate the kind of symbolic narratives that can hold a terrified community together. When the shaman emerges from that smoke-filled cave hours later, speaking in a voice that seems to come from somewhere else, describing a vision of the reindeer herd moving through a pass 3 days to the east, the community does not question whether the shaman was hallucinating. They question whether the vision is true. And if the hunters go to that pass and find the reindeer, the shaman's authority is confirmed, the ritual is validated, and the practice of smoking is inscribed even more deeply into the cultural DNA of the group. But smoking was not only for shamans and spiritual specialists. The archaeological and ethnographic record suggests that smoking served a wide range of practical, social, and medical functions in ancient societies that would be immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever used a cigarette as a social lubricant or a stress reliever, even if the specific contexts were radically different. Hunters used stimulant plants, including early forms of tobacco and coca, to suppress appetite and increase endurance during long tracking expeditions. In a world where calories were scarce and the ability to remain motionless for hours while waiting for prey could mean the difference between feast and famine, a plant that dulled hunger pangs and sharpened focus was not a luxury but a survival tool. Warriors in various cultures smoked before battle to deaden fear and increase aggression, a practice that persisted well into the historical period and that finds its modern echo in the cigarette breaks of soldiers in the trenches of the 20th century. Diplomats and leaders smoked together to seal treaties and alliances, the shared inhalation of a sacred substance creating a temporary bond of trust that transcended language barriers and political calculations. Healers used smoked or fumigated substances to treat respiratory ailments, paradoxically using smoke to clear congestion, to drive out what were believed to be disease-causing spirits, and to disinfect spaces where the sick were housed. The medical logic was often wrong in its specifics, but it was not entirely wrong in its intuitions. Many of the plants used in ancient smoking rituals genuinely do contain compounds with antimicrobial, analgesic, or psychoactive properties. The problem was not that ancient humans were stupid or superstitious. The problem was that they lacked the tools to separate the genuinely therapeutic effects from the toxic ones, and they lacked the conceptual framework to understand that the same plant could heal in small doses and kill in large ones. that the same smoke that drove away mosquitoes was also scarring their lungs and predisposing them to cancers they could not name. The evolutionary psychology of smoking is one of the darkest and most fascinating chapters in the human story, because it reveals how a behavior that is objectively harmful can become so deeply embedded in our social and cognitive architecture that it persists for millennia, spreading across cultures and continents like a slow-moving virus that we voluntarily invite into our bodies. At its core, smoking hijacks the brain's reward system, the ancient neural machinery that evolved to reinforce behaviors essential for survival: eating, mating, social bonding, escaping danger. When nicotine or other psychoactive compounds enter the bloodstream through the lungs, they trigger a massive release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's pleasure center, creating a sensation of satisfaction and well-being that is difficult to replicate through any other means. For ancient humans, whose lives were defined by scarcity, unpredictability, and constant low-level trauma, this artificial activation of the reward system must have felt like a gift from the gods themselves, a way to temporarily escape the grinding anxiety of existence without the need for food, sex, or safety. But the brain is a learning machine, and it quickly adapts to repeated artificial stimulation by downregulating its own dopamine production and increasing the number of receptors, creating a state of tolerance that requires ever larger doses to achieve the same effect. The ancient smoker who began by inhaling a small amount of tobacco or cannabis during a monthly ritual found over months and years that they needed more smoke, more frequent sessions, just to feel normal. The ritual became a habit, the habit became a dependency, and the dependency became a physiological need that could not be easily denied without experiencing withdrawal symptoms: irritability, anxiety, insomnia, a profound sense that something essential was missing from the world. Ancient humans did not have the vocabulary to describe addiction as we understand it, but they knew the craving. They knew the restlessness that came when the smoking herbs ran out. They knew the desperation that drove traders to travel hundreds of miles to obtain specific plants, that led to conflicts and alliances centered on control of smoking material, that made the burning of certain leaves one of the most valuable and dangerous activities in their world. The communal dimension of ancient smoking cannot be overstated, because it explains why the practice survived and spread even as individuals must have noticed, on some level, that it was damaging their health. Smoking was almost never a solitary activity in prehistory. It was done in groups, around fires, in ceremonial spaces, in the presence of witnesses who validated the experience and gave it meaning. The shared altered state created a bond among participants that was stronger than ordinary social ties, a temporary dissolution of individual identity into a collective consciousness that could make decisions, resolve conflicts, and plan for the future with a sense of unity that was otherwise difficult to achieve in egalitarian bands where no single leader held absolute authority. The pipe circle, the smoking hut, the fireside ritual, these were the original boardrooms, the original therapy sessions, the original social media platforms where information was exchanged, alliances were formed, and cultural norms were transmitted from one generation to the next. To refuse to participate in smoking was not merely a personal choice, it was a social rupture, a rejection of the community's most sacred bonding ritual, a declaration of independence that could lead to ostracism or worse. Ancient humans were not more foolish or more easily manipulated than modern humans. They were simply embedded in social systems where the costs of nonconformity were often higher than the costs of physical harm, where the immediate psychological and social benefits of smoking outweighed the delayed and invisible costs of lung damage and addiction. And then, in a geological blink of an eye, everything changed. The Industrial Revolution did not merely transform smoking, it weaponized it, stripped it of its cultural context, and turned it into a mass-produced mechanism for extracting profit from human vulnerability. What had been a sacred, restricted, often dangerous ritual practiced by specific individuals in specific contexts became a commodity available to anyone with a few coins in their pocket. The ancient shaman who inhaled smoke to communicate with spirits would not recognize the modern cigarette, with its engineered blend of tobacco varieties, its chemical additives designed to enhance nicotine delivery, its filter that promises safety while delivering nothing of the kind, its packaging designed by marketing psychologists to trigger desire and loyalty. The ancient hunter who chewed coca leaves to suppress hunger during a long tracking expedition would be horrified by the refined cocaine that destroyed urban communities in the late 20th century. The ancient healer who fumigated a sick room with antimicrobial herbs would weep at the sight of a factory producing millions of cigarettes an hour, each one a tiny, perfectly optimized delivery system for addiction and disease. The modern inversion is almost too cynical to believe, yet it is the water we swim in. A practice that began as a way to expand consciousness, to heal the sick, to bond communities, and to survive in a hostile world has become, for billions of people, a mechanism for shortening life, a way to trade decades of future health for a few minutes of present relief, a ritual that no longer connects us to the spirits or to each other, but isolates us in our addiction, each smoker alone with their cigarette, their vape, their pipe, staring at a screen while their lungs turn to leather and their arteries harden. The final horror is not that ancient humans smoked. Given what we know about neurochemistry, about the human need for altered states, about the social functions of shared ritual, smoking was probably inevitable, a discovery waiting to happen as soon as the first hominid leaned over a fire and inhaled something more interesting than plain wood smoke. The horror is what we have done with that discovery, how we have taken a tool that was once as carefully controlled as a scalpel or a sacred text and turned it into a blunt instrument of mass consumption, marketed to children, optimized for addiction, and defended by industries that have known for decades that their product kills their customers. The ancient shaman who pushed their mind to absolute extremes to bring back wisdom for their people was performing a dangerous but meaningful act. The modern teenager who vapes in a school bathroom, inhaling flavored nicotine salts that deliver a hit more potent than any ancient pipe ever could, is performing an act that has been stripped of all meaning except the biochemical one, the desperate attempt to feel something, anything, in a world that has monetized their anxiety and sold it back to them in disposable pods. The ancient human who knelt over that first fire and chose to inhale was making a gamble. A terrible, beautiful, stupid gamble that their brain could handle the smoke, that the visions were worth the damage, that the community needed the ritual more than the individual needed pristine lungs. They could not have known that their descendants, tens of thousands of years later, would be making the same gamble every day, not in caves or sacred groves, but in parking lots and office stairwells, not with plants they had gathered and prepared with their own hands, but with products designed by chemists in sterile laboratories, not for communion with spirits or survival against the wilderness, but for profit. The fire still burns, the smoke still rises, but the reason we inhale has been lost, and in its place, we have built a machine that smokes us,